Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to find you in this quiet hour. Tell me, is there a document near you this evening? A letter, perhaps? Or an old book whose pages carry the particular stillness of things long, undisturbed? Watson understood that records hold more than facts. They hold the shape of what people wish to conceal. Do subscribe, so no chapter goes unread. Now, settle in, for as Holmes observed, it is what has been preserved. And why? That tells the truest story. Find us on Watson's Margins, on Spotify. The link is just below. Chapter 1. The Keeper of the Family Record. It is not often that I find myself with cause to remark upon the weather as a fitting accomplice to drama, yet there are evenings in London when the atmosphere conspires so completely with the circumstances of a case that one would be remiss to pass the matter over in silence. Such was the case on the 14th of October, in the year of which I write, when a persistent drizzle had settled upon Baker Street, like a grey, unwelcome tenant, obscuring the gas lamps, and lending the wet cobblestones a quality of dull pewter that I have always found peculiarly dispiriting. Holmes and I had spent the afternoon in companionable idleness. He had devoted the better portion of it to a chemical experiment of some obscurity, involving a series of small brown bottles and a disagreeable odour that prompted Mrs. Hudson to appear at the threshold of the sitting-room on no fewer than 3 occasions, each visit accompanied by an expression of increasing reproach. I had busied myself with the evening papers and a volume of army reminiscences that I had been meaning to complete for some weeks, though in truth the warmth of the fire made concentration something of an effort. Holmes had pushed his equipment aside some time after 5 o'clock and settled into his armchair, pressing his long fingers together beneath his chin in an attitude that I recognised at once as the posture of deliberate vacancy. He was, as he had informed me on a previous occasion, resting the instrument rather than abandoning it, clearing the mechanism as he would have it, whatever accumulated debris 3 days of thin cases had deposited there. I mention all of this not from any desire to delay the substance of what followed, because the quiet of that evening made Lady Honoria Bellamy's arrival all the more striking by contrast. She was announced by Mrs. Hudson at 7:15, and she entered with the controlled urgencies of a person who has spent considerable effort convincing health that there is no need for haste and has very nearly succeeded. She was perhaps 50 years of age, still handsome in the manner of a woman who had been remarkable in youth, dressed in deep charcoal with a travelling cloak, that bore the marks of a journey undertaken without quite enough forethought. Gloves were correct, her posture admirable, but her eyes betrayed her immediately. They moved across the room with the swift, involuntary assessment of a person who has grown accustomed to measuring every space for the exits it contains. Holmes rose to greet her with a civility that surprised me, only because I had expected him to remain immobile until satisfied as to the quality of the interruption. He was evidently already satisfied. "Lady Honoria Bellamy," he said, drawing forward the better of our 2 chairs, "Blackthorn Court in Surrey. Pray sit down. You have come directly from Waterloo, I observe, and you are not yet quite decided upon how much to tell me." The lady paused in the act of removing her glove and regarded him with an expression that mingled affront with relief. "You are perceptive, Mr. Holmes." "I am observant," he replied pleasantly, settling once more into his own chair. "My friend Dr. Watson will be kind enough to remain. He is discreet, and I find his presence useful when ladies are good enough to consult me." Lady Honoria glanced briefly in my direction, Proust, and I offered what I hoped was a sufficiently reassuring inclination of the head. She appeared to accept the arrangement, clasped her hands in her lap, with the decisiveness of a person completing a private negotiation. Pot, pot. What followed was a narrative, delivered with the mixture of precision and careful omission, that I have come to regard as the characteristic mode of speech of those who fear they know more than is comfortable. Lady Honoria was companion to Sir Reginald Bellamy, whom she described as the master of Blackthorn Court, and the supreme custodian of what she called an emphasis that struck me as weighted beyond mere family pride, the family registry. Sir Reginald, she explained, was a man of severe temperament and methodical habit, who had for 4 decades maintained a genealogical archive of extraordinary completeness. Bellamy family was an old one, its branches stretching back through Surrey and further, its inheritance questions settled not by lawyers alone, but by reference to a physical archive of remarkable scope. Ledgers, scrolls, certificates of marriage and birth, correspondence bearing official seals, all housed in a dedicated chamber beneath the west staircase of Blackthorn Court and accessible to Sir Reginald alone. He carried the chamber's key upon his person at all times. He had been known, Lady Honoria said quietly, to sleep with it. The records were not, she was at pains to emphasise, a matter of sentiment. They determined succession. They governed the distribution of a considerable estate. They established, in the most legally concrete sense, who was who. And recently, she told us, there had been cause to suspect that certain entries within the registry might have been altered. Holmes had listened throughout with his eyes half closed and his fingers still pressed together. "Recently," he repeated. "Within the past month, or within the past week?" "Within the past fortnight," she said. Sir Reginald noticed discrepancies that he could not explain. He has said nothing to the household, but I know him well enough to read his disturbance. He has been conducting a private examination of the older volumes. Host. Holmes asked her then to describe the inhabitants of Blackthorn Court, and she did so with a care that confirmed my impression of her as a woman of no small intelligence. She named 5 principal figures: Edmund Bellamy, Sir Reginald's eldest nephew, and the presumed heir, a young man of good address and strained finances; Clara Bellamy, widowed niece, who had lived at the court for some years in a state of quiet dependence; Julian Fane, the family solicitor, tended the estate regularly, and whose professional standing was, as Lady Honoria put it, entirely anchored to the integrity of the records he administered; Miss Eleanor Graves, Lady Honoria's own companion, she described without particular warmth as quietly observant; and Captain Lionel Bellamy, the younger branch of the family, man who had distinguished himself in no professional capacity, and who was understood to be excluded from the principal inheritance. Holmes listened to each description with evident interest. When she had concluded, he was silent for a moment, examining the ceiling. "You have said that Sir Reginald has spoken to no one in the household," Holmes said at last. "Yet someone has, by your account, tampered with the records. Why do you come to me now, rather than to the police?" "Because," Lady Honoria said. Here her composure wavered for the first time. "The police would make it public, and in this house, Mr. Holmes, reputation is worth more than blood." The phrase arrested my attention, and I saw Holmes's eyes open fully for the first time since the lady had begun to speak. He regarded her for a moment with an expression I could not quite interpret. Not surprise, precisely, but the alert stillness of a man who has heard a note of unexpected resonance. "A curious way of framing the matter," he said, "particularly in a house whose difficulty appears to concern bloodlines in the most literal sense." Lady Honoria held his gaze without flinching, chose the words deliberately, Mr. Holmes. He rose from his chair with the unhurried energy that signified a decision already reached. "Very well," he said, moving to the mantelpiece and lifting his pipe from its accustomed position. "I shall require the morning train to Surrey, Watson's company, and your assurance that Sir Reginald will receive us. The first two are yours to arrange," she said, rising in turn. "The third I can promise." After Lady Honoria had departed, I remained for some while in reflective silence. Holmes stood at the window, watching the rain move in slow curtains across the gas-lit street below. His pipe was alight, and the blue smoke curled upward in the draught from the sash, with a patience that seemed almost deliberate. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked at length. "I make very little of it as yet, Watson," he said, without turning from the window. "Which is, I find, precisely the correct condition in which to approach Blackthorn Court. The cases that arrive wearing the appearance of simplicity invariably reveal themselves to be built upon a foundation that no one thought to examine. The interesting question is never what has been changed." He paused. The rain tapped softly against the pane. "It is what has been preserved," he said. "And why?" I made no reply to that, having none ready. Holmes continued to regard the street with the focused abstraction that I had learned, over many years, to interpret as the beginning of something rather than the absence of it. I returned to my book, though in truth I read very little. Thoughts were occupied, as I suspected his were, with an old house in Surrey, and a locked room beneath a staircase, and a hollow column of carved wood that kept its secrets in the dark. The chapter "The Chamber Beneath the West Stair," the morning train from Waterloo deposited us at the small Surrey station of Fenwick Cross, shortly before 11, where a trap had been arranged by Lady Honoria to convey us the remaining 3 miles to Blackthorn Court. The rain of the previous evening had cleared overnight, leaving in its wake a morning of pale, watery sunlight, and an autumnal freshness that might, in other circumstances, have been invigorating. Holmes spent the journey in silence, his coat collar turned up, and his sharp profile angled toward the passing hedgerows as though the Surrey countryside held information he had not yet finished extracting. Blackthorn Court announced itself long before one could properly see it. The approach road, flanked by ancient elms, whose upper branches had begun to surrender to the season, curved for half a mile through grounds that had once been formal, and now maintained a kind of severe tidiness, as though beauty had been permitted to a certain point and no further. When the house itself came into view, I understood at once the nature of the household within it. It was a large, Jacobean structure of dark stone, its many windows looking out upon the grounds with an expression, if architecture may be said to possess one, perpetual vigilance. There was nothing welcoming about it. It had been built to endure, and to remind those within it that endurance was the primary virtue expected of them. Sir Reginald Bellamy received us in a study furnished entirely in shades of brown and shadow. He was a tall man, still vigorous at what I estimated to be 70 years, with the precise bearing of a man who has spent decades ensuring that nothing in his person should be open to interpretation. His handshake was firm and brief. His eyes assessed Holmes and myself with the rapid, personal efficiency of a customs officer examining baggage. Lady Honoria has exceeded her brief in bringing you here, he said, returning immediately to the chair behind his desk, as though to establish the geometry of the meeting beyond further negotiation. I have not determined that the matter warrants outside involvement. And yet you have not turned us away, Holmes observed pleasantly, settling into a chair without waiting to be invited. Which suggests, Sir Reginald, that your uncertainty on the matter is rather more pronounced than your manner implies. The old man regarded Holmes for a moment with an expression that I believe was intended to communicate displeasure, but which contained, if I am not mistaken, a thread of reluctant respect. He said nothing further on the subject of our welcome, and instead answered Holmes's questions with the measured brevity of a man who has learned to give away only precisely as much as is required. He confirmed Lady Honoria's account in all essentials, though he was careful to frame the anomalies in the registry as possible clerical errors rather than deliberate interference. The registry chamber, he informed us, lay beneath the west staircase, accessible by a narrow passage of stone. He alone held the key. No other person in the household had, to his knowledge, entered the chamber in the past 6 months. Holmes asked to see it, and after a pause that lasted rather longer than mere consideration required, Sir Reginald agreed. The chamber was smaller than I had imagined, and considerably colder. The passage leading to it was barely wide enough for 2 persons abreast, lit by a single bracket lamp that Sir Reginald carried himself. The room beyond was perhaps 15 feet by 10, its walls occupied by iron cabinets of considerable age, their locks polished by decades of use. At the far end stood the object that Lady Honoria had mentioned, and that I had found myself picturing during the journey south. The registry column. It rose nearly to the ceiling, a carved wooden structure of considerable elegance, octagonal in section, and ornamented along its panels with the Bellamy device repeated at intervals. It looked, in the lamplight, rather like a reliquary, an object built less to contain something than to honour it. Holmes moved through the chamber without speaking. He examined the cabinets first, running a finger along the seams of several drawers, lifting and replacing a volume with the care of a man who does not wish the subject of his examination to know what he has noticed. Then he stood before the registry column, for some time, his hands in his pockets, making no movement that I could detect beyond a slight forward inclination of the head. You keep the key to the column separately from the chamber key? He asked without turning. Sir Reginald's response was a fraction too slow, kept upon my person. Holmes turned then and smiled. Yes, he simply. I see that it is. We were shown out shortly afterward, and the remainder of the afternoon was given over to the customs of the household. Dinner at Blackthorn Court was an exercise in organised discomfort. Table was set for 8, and I had leisure to observe each of the figures Lady Honoria had named from across the considerable expanse of white, linen and silver. Edmund Bellamy sat to Sir Reginald's left. He was perhaps 35, with the handsome, slightly overdrawn features of a man who has traded upon his appearance rather longer than it will continue to serve him. He drank moderately, and spoke little, but his eyes seldom left his uncle's face, and the quality of his attention had nothing of affection in it. Across the table, Clara Bellamy maintained a studied brightness that required perceptible effort. She was some years older than Edmund, slender, dressed with the subdued elegance of a woman who has not quite accepted the financial constraint that has made subdued elegance necessary. She turned toward him with the trained attentiveness of someone who has learned to treat proximity to power as a precaution. Julian Fane sat further down the table, a spare, dry man of middle age with careful hands and the habit of completing other people's sentences slightly before they had finished them. He spoke to Holmes with the surface affability of a man who has decided that charm is more efficient than caution, and who has not yet been made to regret this policy. Captain Lionel Bellamy arrived late, offered no apology, and consumed a quantity of claret that the others, I noticed, were careful not to remark upon. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps 28, with a restless quality that sat uneasily upon a frame otherwise built for stillness. He made one comment during the meal, addressing the table generally. I have always found family dinners most instructive. One learns a great deal about what people are afraid of saying. Nobody responded, and he appeared satisfied with this result. Miss Eleanor Graves said almost nothing. She was Lady Honoria's companion, in fact, as well as title, seated beside her, attentive, occasionally helpful, and I might have dismissed her as a minor figure entirely. Had I not caught her watching Holmes during the second course with expression of assessment so deliberate that it struck me as entirely at odds with her carefully unremarkable presentation. After dinner, Holmes and I walked briefly in the grounds before retiring. The night was clear, the stars indifferent to the tensions of the house behind us. "Well," I said, when we were comfortably beyond hearing range of any window. "3 matters," Holmes said without preamble, began to count them upon his fingers. First, certain entries in the open registry volumes have been recopied. Ink is fresher than the surrounding text by a margin that is inconsistent with fading patterns elsewhere on the same pages. Second, the dates of 2 entries concerning marriages in the previous generation are internally consistent in one respect and impossible in another. I shall explain the precise nature of the impossibility when I have confirmed it. Third, he paused, glanced back once at the dark shape of the house against the sky. Third, the registry column has been opened within the past fortnight. The marks of the key on the inner plate are recent. Sir Reginald did not open it. He was as interested in those marks as I was, considerably more disturbed by them. I turned this over for a moment. Meaning someone else has a key. Or, Holmes said, turning back toward the house, meaning that the key Sir Reginald carries so carefully is not quite so unique as he believes. We went in, shortly after. I slept fitfully, conscious of the house settling around me with the slow, deliberate sounds of old stone, of something less diphonable. The feeling one sometimes has in a place where a question has been put off for so long, that the air itself has grown tense with the waiting. The disturbance came at 2:30 in the morning. Chapter 3. The Locked Registry Room. I have attended a course of my association with Sherlock Holmes upon a number of scenes that might reasonably be described as alarming. I have grown through long practice, tolerably composed in the face of the unexpected, Proust. Yet there is a particular quality to being woken in the dead hours of the night by a sound whose nature one cannot immediately determine. Something between a fall and a cry, absorbed and flattened by old stone, that resists the composure one might manage in daylight. I was on my feet before I was fully conscious of having decided to rise. Holmes was already in the corridor when I opened my door. He had not undressed, which I noted without surprise. He held a candle in one hand and had paused at the head of the staircase, head tilted, listening with the concentrated stillness of a hunting animal fixed upon a sound it has not yet identified. "Below," he said quietly, and descended. The household converged upon the west passage by degrees. First, Holmes and I, then Edmund Bellamy in a dressing-gown, carrying a lamp with the careful steadiness of a man who had not been asleep. Then Fane, some minutes later, pale and correct even in disarray. Lady Honoria appeared, at the far end of the passage in a dark robe, her expression that of a person who has been dreading a particular moment, and has arrived at it at last. The registry chamber door was locked from within. This fact required a moment to absorb. The door was of solid oak, banded with iron in the old style, and the lock was of the mortice variety that operates identically from either face. Holmes knelt at the keyhole, through it, for several seconds, then rose and turned to the assembled faces with an expression of careful neutrality. "Key is in the lock on the interior side," he said. "Watson, will you assist me?" It required the combined effort of Holmes, myself, the butler, a broad, unhappy man named Cranfield, who had appeared from somewhere further along the passage, to force the door. The hinges were old, but the oak was not, and it gave with a sound like a pistol report that brought Clara Bellamy and Miss Graves to the passage entrance, where they stood close together and said nothing. Sir Reginald lay upon the stone floor beside the registry column. He had fallen sideways, his right shoulder against the base of the column's carved plinth, and he lay with the particular stillness that is distinct from sleep and from death and from unconsciousness, though it was the last of these that I confirmed as I knelt beside him and established a pulse, slow and irregular beneath my fingers. A lantern lay shattered some 2 feet from his head, its oil pool dark against the pale stone. The cabinet nearest the door stood open, its contents undisturbed so far as I could judge. I sent Cranfield for blankets and hot water, directed that a groom be dispatched for the nearest doctor, a precaution that Holmes endorsed with a brief nod before turning his attention away from Sir Reginald entirely, and directing it toward the room itself. He moved with that quality of focused efficiency that always distinguished his examination of a scene from any mere inspection. Not hurried, never careless, possessed of an economy of motion that conveyed the impression of a man who knows precisely what questions he is answering. He examined the lock, door frame, the shattered lantern, the open cabinet. He knelt at the base of the registry column and remained there for perhaps 2 minutes, without speaking. When he rose, his expression told me nothing, which told me rather a great deal. Sir Reginald survived the night, following morning, and a portion of the afternoon. He regained a kind of partial consciousness in the hours before the local doctor arrived, and again briefly in the early afternoon. But on neither occasion was he capable of coherent speech. What he produced instead was a kind of pressured murmuring, the words fragmentary and rearranged by whatever internal disturbance had overtaken him, and I could make nothing of it. During one interval of apparent lucidity, he turned his head and raised his right hand with evident intention, directing it not toward any of the persons present, but toward the registry column at the far end of the room. Whether this constituted a gesture of significance or the random motion of an injured and bewildered man, I could not with honesty determine. He died at 20 minutes past 3. The household's response confirmed in its way what Holmes and I had already begun to suspect. Grief, where it appeared at all, had the quality of an obligation discharged rather than a feeling sustained. Edmund, upon being informed, asked within the same minute whether Fane had secured the testamentary documents. Fane himself did not wait to be asked. He was in the study within the half hour, working with methodical speed through the papers in Sir Reginald's desk, explaining to anyone who inquired that he was fulfilling his professional duty by ensuring the records were in order before any official party could arrive and complicate matters. Clara came to me privately in the corridor outside the study and put her hand briefly on my arm. "Dr. Watson," she said, "I hope Mr. Holmes will be guided by discretion. The family has endured a great deal. The living must be considered alongside the dead." I said that Holmes was always guided by the evidence. I recognised, even as I said, it was not quite the reassurance she was seeking. Captain Lionel left the estate on horseback at some point during the morning, and did not return until well past 4 in the afternoon, offering no account of his absence. When Holmes noted this, with a mildness that did not deceive me, met his gaze with an equanimity that struck me as either innocence or considerable nerve. The local inspector, a man named Dimmock, arrived from the village at 2:30, and conducted himself with the confident briskness of a man who believes he has encountered, in a novel setting, a problem he has already solved. He examined the chamber, spoke at length with Cranfield, and briefly with Holmes, and arrived at a conclusion that he communicated to me with the satisfied air of one delivering a verdict he considers beyond appeal. "Robbery and inheritance greed," he said. "Straightforward enough, when you strip away the grand surroundings. A wealthy man, a locked room, house full of people who stand to benefit. The nephew's debts are known in the village." I mentioned that the chamber had been locked from within. Dimmock allowed that this was a complication and moved on. Holmes, who had listened to this exchange from across the corridor, without contributing to it, waited until Dimmock had gone to speak with Edmund before he turned to me with a look of dry patience. "The inspector finds the room puzzling, and has resolved this difficulty by electing not to think about it. An approach with a certain brutal efficiency, I grant you, not one that will survive scrutiny." He glanced toward the registry chamber door, which Cranfield had been instructed by Dimmock to keep closed. "Troubles me, Watson, is not the locked door." "What troubles you, then?" "The servants," he said. "I have spoken to 3 of them this morning. They are not grieving, which is unremarkable in a household such as this, but they are frightened. That is a different matter entirely." He paused. "Cranfield has told me something of interest. Sir Reginald altered the household timetable 3 nights before last night's events. He relieved several of the servants from their usual stations in the west corridor after midnight. I considered this. He was expecting someone, I said. Or, Holmes said, he was ensuring privacy for something he intended to do himself. He looked again at the closed door. Sir Reginald was a man of exact habits and considerable will. He did not rearrange the movements of his household for trivial reasons. He said nothing further, and I did not press him forward. There are moments in the prosecution of Holmes's cases when his silence is more instructive than his speech, and I have learned, though not without difficulty, to attend to both. What I knew with certainty as the afternoon closed in around Blackthorn Court was this: that a man was dead, that the room in which he had fallen had been locked against all entry, that the key had been in the lock on the interior side, and that the household in which these facts had arranged themselves appeared, as a whole, rather more afraid of the truth than of the person, whoever that might prove to be who had been the instrument of them. Chapter 4. The Empty Compartment. Holmes requested exclusive access to the registry chamber the following morning, and obtained it by the simple expedient of presenting Inspector Dimmock with a question so technically involved. The differential concerning the differential rates, ink oxidization in documents stored in conditions of variable humidity, that the inspector decided, with visible relief, that the chamber was Holmes's concern for as long as he wished it. I accompanied Holmes inside. Cranfield closed the door behind us, and we heard his footsteps recede along the stone passage, with the grateful haste of a man released from comfortable duty. The room, in daylight, admitted through a single narrow window set high in the outer wall, was rather different from the room of the previous night. By lamplight, it had possessed a kind of oppressive grandeur. In the thin morning light it was merely cold and old and very quiet. The shattered lantern had been cleared away on Dimmock's instruction, fact that produced from Holmes a brief expression of irritation that he did not bother to conceal. He began not with the registry column, which I had expected, but with the window. It was small, set into stonework of considerable thickness, and latched from within by means of an iron bar seated in 2 brackets. Holmes examined the brackets, the bar, the stone surround, exterior ledge. This last by the method of pressing his face close to the glass and angling his examination along the wall, before pronouncing himself satisfied and moving on. The cabinets occupied perhaps 20 minutes. He worked through them with systematic patience, opening each in sequence, examining the contents without removing them, occasionally holding a page at an angle to the light, in a manner that suggested he was reading the surface rather than the text. At the 3rd cabinet he paused for rather longer than the others, and he closed it. His expression had acquired the particular quality of controlled attention that I associated with a discovery he was not yet prepared to articulate. When he finally turned his attention to the registry column itself, his approach was unhurried to the point of deliberateness. He walked around it once, examining each of the 8 carved panels in sequence. Then he produced from his coat pocket the small lens he habitually carried, and applied it to the column's lower section, moving upward by degrees. Point approximately 3 feet from the base, he stopped. "Come and look at this, Watson." I joined him and looked where he indicated. First, I could see nothing beyond the ordinary surface of the carving. A repeating pattern of interlaced foliage with the Bellamy device at the centre of each panel. Then I noticed what his lens had evidently shown him. A seam running vertically through what appeared to be solid wood interrupted the carving, with a hairline precision that might, at normal viewing distance, be taken for a deliberate groove in the design. "A door," I said. "A panel," Holmes corrected, with the gentle pedantry that emerged when he felt the distinction mattered. "The mechanism is here." He pressed his thumb against a particular leaf in the carved pattern, one that I would not have distinguished from any of its neighbours, and the panel gave inward with the soft resistance of something that has been opened many times and has been recently opened again. The compartment within was perhaps 8 inches deep, running vertically for some 2 feet. It was empty. Holmes stood looking into it for a long moment without speaking. Then he reached inside and ran his fingers carefully along the inner surfaces, floor, walls, ceiling of the space, and withdrew his hand. On the tips of 2 fingers there was a faint dark smear that might have been old dust, compacted by pressure, or might have been something else. "The ledger volume that is missing from the cabinets," I said, "was kept here. Been kept here for some considerable time," Holmes said. "The marks on the base of the compartment are consistent with a volume of specific dimensions, wider than the standard cabinet ledgers by approximately an inch, and bound in a material that has left a residue of a particular kind. Vellum, I think." rather than leather. He pressed the panel closed and stood back. It was removed, Watson, but not last night. The disturbance of the dust suggests it was taken at least a week before Sir Reginald's collapse, possibly longer. This was a material point. I said so. It is the first material point. Holmes agreed. He turned and surveyed the room from where he stood, the registry column behind him, cabinets along the walls, the high-ceiled window admitting its rectangle of grey light. Let us consider what else this room tells us. He moved to the fireplace. A small, functional affair set into the wall opposite the window, plainly disused for many years given the accumulation of cold debris in its grate, but not entirely disused. Holmes crouched before it and examined the interior with his lens, then reached in and withdrew what appeared to be a small fragment of charred paper, handling it with considerable delicacy. "Someone has burned documents here," he said. "Recently, within the past week, I should judge. The ash is undisturbed in the upper portions, and disturbed only at the burning point, which indicates a single controlled fire rather than accumulated use over time." He replaced the fragment with care. Furthermore, he rose and moved to the cabinet he had lingered over earlier, opening it again. The older volumes in this cabinet have had pages removed. Not torn, cut, with something fine. A razor, perhaps, or a surgical blade. The excisions are at the binding edge. Done with sufficient care that a cursory examination would miss them entirely. I examined the volumes he indicated. He was correct. The pages had been removed so cleanly that only by riffling the edges carefully could one detect the slight irregularity in thickness that betrayed an absence. "Then, whoever has interfered with the registry has been thorough," I said. Holmes closed the cabinet. "Thorough," he said, "but not consistent. The recopied entries I identified on our first examination were done hastily. Pen pressure is uneven, and the letter forms vary in ways that suggest anxiety rather than care. The page excisions, on the other hand, the work of patience. I am dealing, I think, with interference, conducted on at least 2 separate occasions, by persons who were not necessarily working in concert, and who may not have known what the other had done. This was a perspective I had not considered, and it shifted the character of the matter considerably. I said so. "Yes," Holmes said, "complicates the simple inheritance theory rather substantially. One further thing, Watson, the footprints in the passage outside. I had not thought to examine them, and said so. Dimmock's men have obscured the majority. Before they arrived this morning, I made a record of what remained. There are no prints in the passage that do not belong to members of the household. No servant's boots, no tradesman's sole, no unknown visitor." He paused. "Whatever has occurred within these walls, it has not involved an outsider. We emerged from the chamber into the passage when the morning light was somewhat warmer, and the sounds of the house. A door, a voice, the distant movement of someone on the upper floor, had resumed about us. The ordinary business of a household in the aftermath of a death, making its practical accommodations." Holmes stopped Dimmock at the end of the passage and listened with courteous patience as the inspector reported that Edmund Bellamy had, it appeared, made several unsuccessful applications for substantial loans against the security of his anticipated inheritance, a fact which Dimmock presented with the emphasis of a man producing a trump card. Holmes thanked him with every appearance of sincerity. When the inspector had gone, he turned to me with an expression I recognised. "Men kill for money every day, Watson," he said. "They destroy records only when money is the lesser danger." He said nothing more and went upstairs to think. Chapter 5. The Silent Agreement. The afternoon following Sir Reginald's death brought a change in the atmosphere of Black Court that I found more unsettling in its way than the crisis itself. A house in the immediate grip of shock has a coherence to it. The shared suspension of ordinary life, the convergence upon a single fact. What replaced that, as the hours passed and the practical machinery of death began its quiet operation, something harder to name. The household did not grieve together. It dispersed, pros, each member retreating to a private calculation that they conducted behind faces of appropriate gravity, emerging only when the requirements of decency made solitude impossible. It was, I thought, less like a family in mourning than a set of individual parties, each reviewing a contract whose terms had just materially changed. Holmes spent the earlier part of the afternoon in his room, which with Holmes meant thinking rather than resting, and I occupied myself with a letter to my practice manager in London, and a fruitless attempt to read the volume I had brought from Baker Street. At 3:30, he appeared in the doorway of the small sitting room that had been placed at our disposal, and informed me that he intended to speak with Clara Bellamy, and that he would prefer to do so without my presence. I did not take this as a slight. Poor. There are interviews in which Watson is useful, and interviews in which Watson is a distraction, and Holmes has always been candid, if not invariably tactful on the subject of which is which. I gathered that Clara Bellamy was a woman whose confidences would come more readily, without an audience, and accepted the assessment. He was gone for rather more than an hour. When he returned, he settled into the chair across from mine, and was silent for a moment, in the way that signified he was arranging what he had learned into the order in which he intended to convey it. "Clara Bellamy," he said at last, "is a more complicated figure than she appears, and she appears fairly complicated to begin with. She has lived at Blackthorn Court for 9 years, since the death of her husband, under an arrangement that has never been formalised, and has therefore always been revocable. Sir Reginald could have ended it at any point, which gave her considerable reason to keep him satisfied," I said. "Considerable reason to keep him comfortable," Holmes corrected, precision that I recognised as intentional. Satisfaction implies active approval. What Clara required was the absence of active disapproval, which is a different condition, and in some respects a more precarious one. He leaned back. "She told me, after a period of resistance, that I will not tax you with in detail, that some years before her arrival at the court, 14 years ago, she believes, though she was not present, and had the account second-hand, Sir Reginald intervened to prevent a proposed marriage." "Whose marriage?" "Hers. She had formed an attachment, apparently a serious one, to a musician of foreign extraction, whose name she declined to give me, though I did not press the point, having noted it for later examination. Sir Reginald regarded the connection as ruinous to the family's standing. He made his view known through channels that Clara described as efficient rather than cruel, by which I understand him to have arranged the financial and social circumstances so thoroughly that the musician in question found England inhospitable and departed it. I said nothing for a moment. There is a particular kind of power, exercised within families, by those who control the material conditions of others' lives, that operates without ever raising its voice. Picture Holmes was drawing had the flavour of it. She has been grateful and resentful in equal measure ever since, I said. Precisely, which makes her investment in Sir Reginald's survival both genuine and complicated. Holmes tapped his fingers once on the arm of the chair. She was, however, not the interview I found most instructive. That distinction belongs to Fane. Julian Fane had come to Holmes of his own accord. It appeared, sometime, during Clara's interview, leaving a message with Cranfield that he wished to speak with Mr. Holmes at his earliest convenience. Holmes had called upon him in the library immediately upon concluding with Clara, and found him in a state that Holmes described, characteristic understatement, as carefully contained anxiety. He spoke at considerable length about the importance of procedural continuity, Holmes said. He used the phrase maintaining continuity no fewer than 4 times in the course of 20 minutes, which is rather more than the concept requires, even in a legal context. Each time he used it, I noted what he was not quite saying. He never once used the word legality. He spoke of process, of record, of continuity of administration, not of law, as though he were concerned with the appearance of legitimacy rather than the thing itself, I said, slowly. Holmes looked at me with the brief, genuine approval he occasionally permitted himself when I had followed his reasoning to its correct conclusion without assistance. Yes, exactly so, solicitor, who is entirely confident of the integrity of his practice, speaks of the law. A solicitor who is managing something more fragile speaks of process. He paused. I shall need to examine the older marriage certificates personally. Fane's unease is concentrated there, though he does not know that I have observed this. There remained the matter of Lady Honoria's confession, which Holmes related last, and which I found the most arresting of the 3 conversations. She had sought him out herself in the late afternoon and had told him, with Holmes said, the air of a woman discharging an obligation that had grown too heavy to carry, that Sir Reginald had for the past several years been conducting a private and systematic review of the family registry. Not as its custodian performing routine maintenance, but as an investigator pursuing a specific suspicion. He believed, Holmes said, that somewhere in the registry there existed an error, or a deception. He was not certain which, and Lady Honoria says he never told her precisely what he suspected, only that he had found, some years earlier, an inconsistency that he could not reconcile, and that he had been working backward through the records ever since, attempting to establish where the fault lay. He was investigating his own family, I said. He was investigating his own archive, Holmes said. There is a distinction, and it is not merely semantic. Sir Reginald's attachment was to the records themselves, to their accuracy, their integrity, function as instruments of truth. Whether the family suffered in consequence appears to have concerned him rather less. I asked Holmes what he made of the secret gathering Lady Honoria had mentioned. The meeting of several House members 2 nights before Sir Reginald's collapse, whose purpose none of them would explain. I make a great deal of it, he said quietly, tells me, that at least 2 members of this household had reached the same conclusion simultaneously, that Sir Reginald's private investigation progressed far enough to become dangerous. They met to discuss what, if anything, could be done. He was still for a moment, his eyes on the middle distance. They share a secret, Watson. Not all of them know the same parts of it, but they know enough to understand that certain questions, if pursued to their conclusions, will be catastrophic for all of them. Word he had used stayed with me. Catastrophic in what sense? That, Holmes said, is the question I intend to answer tomorrow. What? A hose. He rose and moved to the window where the grounds of Blackthorn Court were fading into the early dusk, the elms along the drive reduced to dark suggestions against a pewter sky. I know the shape of the matter now. What I require is the detail that gives it weight, the marriage certificates first. And then I think, conversation with Captain Lionel Bellamy, who has been, you will have noticed, conspicuously absent from all of today's arrangements. I had noticed. Do you think he is avoiding us? Holmes turned from the window. I think he is avoiding the subject, he said, which is a considerably more interesting thing to avoid. Chapter 6. The Fear of Exposure. Holmes was at the marriage certificates before breakfast. I decided upon rising earlier than usual, prompted by a restlessness that the old house seemed to encourage in those who spent the night within it, and making my way down to find the registry chamber passage lit by a lamp that had clearly been burning for some time. Cranfield stationed at the passage entrance, with the expression of a man who has been given contradictory instructions by two authorities, and has resolved the difficulty by obeying the more formidable of them, admitted me without comment. Holmes was at the third cabinet, the one he had returned to twice before, with 3 volumes spread open on the small table that served the room's only practical function, quance a host. He had his lens, and a notebook in which he had been writing, and the particular quality of stillness that indicated he had been at work for sufficiently long that the physical fact of working had receded entirely from his awareness. He acknowledged my arrival with a slight movement of his head and continued to examine the page before him. I waited. Outside, the Surrey morning was making its grey, unhurried appearance at the high window. "The marriage I am looking for," Holmes said, without lifting his eyes from the volume, "took place 31 years ago. The entry, as it currently stands, records a union between one Arthur Conan Doyle, a younger son of the generation preceding Sir Reginald's, and a woman listed as Miss Isabel Farrant, of no county given, no family connection recorded, and no subsequent entries of any kind, children registered, no death notice. She simply appears in the record, is married, and ceases to exist within it. I considered this oversight. Records of that period were not always comprehensive. Records kept by Sir Reginald were always comprehensive. Holmes closed the volume with care and opened the one beside it. Miss Isabel Farrant is the only person connected to the Bellamy line, 40 years of registry entries, whose origins are not cross-referenced, whose family is not documented, and whose subsequent history, children, death, removal abroad, is left entirely blank. In a registry of this character, Watson, a blank is not an absence of information. It is a decision. He showed me what he meant. The surrounding entries, births, marriages, deaths spanning the same decade, were annotated with a thoroughness that reflected, as he had observed, Sir Reginald's exacting temperament. Every person who entered the family record by birth, marriage, or legal connection was given a provenance, however brief. Miss Isabel Farrant had none. She was a name suspended in the record without context, married to a Bellamy heir, and then, far as the official account was concerned, vanished. "And the child?" I asked. I had been thinking, since Holmes's observations the previous evening, about what must logically follow. He looked at me then. "The child," he said, "is registered 3 entries further on. Born to Arthur Conan Doyle, approximately 11 months after the marriage. The mother is not listed, which is, even for this period, unusual. The child's name is recorded as Lionel Arthur Bellamy. The silence that followed was of the kind that requires no filling. I had arrived at the same conclusion that Holmes had clearly reached some time before, but arriving at it oneself, with the evidence laid out in a cold stone room on a grey Surrey morning, carries a particular weight that hearing it stated does not. Captain Lionel Bellamy, whom I had watched drink his way through dinner with the cheerful belligerence of a man belligerence of a man who has decided that the world has given him insufficient reason to behave otherwise, was either the son of a woman whose origins had been deliberately suppressed, or he was something more troubling than that. She was not a Bellamy, I said, not in any sense the family would have recognised. She was not Isabel Farrant either, Holmes said. Or rather she may have been, but the name tells us nothing, because whoever made the original entry intended it to tell us nothing. The question that Sir Reginald had been attempting to resolve was, I believe, not simply who she was, but whether the marriage itself was legally contracted, and if not, then Lionel has no legitimate claim to the Bellamy name at all. I finished. Holmes nodded once. And the consequences of that extend considerably beyond Lionel himself. The family's social position, its network of connections, its credibility as one of Surrey's established houses, all of it built, in part, upon the integrity of a registry that may contain, at its foundation, a deliberate fiction. We left the chamber as the household was beginning to stir, and I spent some part of the morning turning the matter over while Holmes was engaged elsewhere. It was a maid, a young woman named Perkins, who attended Clara Bellamy, and had apparently decided, with the particular moral clarity of the young, the arrival of sudden death in a household justified a measure of candour previously withheld. Who provided the next material piece? She came to me in the corridor outside the breakfast room, with the appearance of someone who has rehearsed an approach and abandoned it at the last moment in favour of directness. She said, without preamble, that she thought I ought to know that 3 nights before Sir Reginald's collapse she had been passing the library on her way to the linen cupboard, and had heard voices within, raised in a manner she described as unlike ordinary conversation. She had distinguished Sir Reginald's voice and Mr. Fane's. Words she had heard clearly were these: "The family name must survive." She did not know which of the 2 men had spoken them, thanked her, and relayed the account to Holmes immediately upon finding him, which was in the upper corridor, where he had apparently been in quiet conversation with Miss Eleanor Graves, Lady Honoria's companion. He listened to the maid's evidence with evident interest, then told me what he had just learned from Miss Graves, that on the night of the secret gathering, the meeting of household members 2 nights before Sir Reginald's collapse, Miss Graves had, from her room adjacent to Lady Honoria's, heard not 2 but 3 voices in the corridor outside. One was unquestionably Sir Reginald's. Gathering, it appeared, had not been conducted in his absence. He had been party to it. That changes the character of the meeting entirely, I said. It changes the character of several things, Holmes said. He leaned against the window frame of the upper corridor, looking down at the drive below, where the elms stood in their autumnal patience. Sir Reginald had found what he was looking for. He knew. He called them together, not because he was still investigating, but because he had concluded his investigation and had determined to act upon it. The meeting was not a conspiracy against him, Watson. It was a confrontation initiated by him. Below, in the drive, Captain Lionel Bellamy appeared on horseback, returning from what appeared to be a solitary morning ride. Even at that distance there was something in his bearing. The set of the shoulders, the deliberate containment of the pace, that struck me as belonging to a man carrying something he had been carrying for a long time, and had not yet found a place to put down. He knows, I said. Not a question. He has suspected for years, Holmes said. Men of his type do not develop that particular quality of bitterness simply from exclusion and debt. from knowing something they cannot prove and cannot escape. He watched as Lionel dismounted and handed the horse to a groom without speaking. The question that has occupied me since this morning, however, is not what Lionel knows. Then, what is it? Holmes turned from the window. It is why Julian Fane is more frightened than any of them, including the man who stands to lose his name. Chapter 7. The Inheritance Theory. Spectre Dimmock arrived at Blackthorn Court the following morning with the energised bearing of a man who has slept well upon a satisfying conclusion, and has come to share it with those who will benefit from hearing it. He had with him a Scourst, who came, a constable who carried a leather case with the self-conscious gravity of one entrusted with important materials past. And he requested that the household assemble in the dining room at 11 o'clock, request that was framed as a courtesy and understood by all parties as a directive. Holmes received this intelligence from Cranfield and said nothing, which communicated more than most men manage with considerable effort, we gathered. As directed, the dining room in morning light was less oppressive than it had been by candlelight at dinner, but the occasion stripped it of whatever formal dignity it usually maintained, leaving it simply a large, cold room in which 7 people had been asked to sit at a table without the organising purpose of a meal. Edmund Bellamy sat with his elbows forward, and his expression carefully composed into the neutral attentiveness of a man determined not to betray anticipation. Fane occupied the chair at the far end, and kept his gaze on the middle distance. Clara sat beside Lady Honoria with her hands folded, and Lionel, arriving last, took a chair against the wall rather than at the table, a positioning I observed Holmes note fart. Dimmock opened with a review of the established facts that demonstrated he had been thorough, at least within the territory he had chosen to examine. He had confirmed Edmund's loan applications through 2 Surrey financial institutions. Substantial amounts advanced against anticipated inheritance in both cases declined. He had established, through inquiries in the village, that Edmund had been at Blackthorn Court for a fortnight before our arrival, rather than the week he had stated, and had been observed on 2 occasions near the west wing of the house at hours that did not correspond to ordinary household routine. More significantly, Dimmock's constable had, in the course of searching the disused study, recovered from the fireplace ash, the fragments that Holmes had already examined and assessed, together with several additional pieces that the constable's more patient sifting had produced. From these, Dimmock announced with evident satisfaction his man had been able to reconstruct sufficient text to suggest that the burned documents concerned amendments to inheritance arrangements. Amendments that, if genuine, would have materially altered the distribution of Sir Reginald's estate. Conclusion. Dimmock Drew was presented with the modest confidence of a craftsman displaying finished work. Edmund Bellamy, indebted and desperate, a host, had discovered or engineered evidence that Sir Reginald intended to revise the inheritance unfavourably, entered the registry chamber by means not yet fully established, had attempted to remove or destroy documents that endangered his position, forced, and in the course of this had precipitated a confrontation with Sir Reginald that had ended in the old man's death. Room received this in silence. Then a witness was introduced, a footman named Bates, who stated that on the night of Sir Reginald's collapse, sometime between midnight and 1 o'clock, he had observed Edmund Bellamy in the west corridor, moving in the direction of the staircase beneath which the registry chamber lay. Edmund was asked whether he wished to respond. He said, flatness, that I found more convincing than any protestation would have been, that he had not entered the registry chamber. He acknowledged. Being in the west corridor, explained it as insomnia, and a search for the decanter. He believed Cranfield had removed to the sideboard, near the library, and did not expand upon this. Dimmock thanked him with a courtesy that contained within it the clear intention of an arrest. Holmes, who had sat through this entire proceeding without having said a single word, now spoke from his position at the side of the room. Quality of the attention that shifted toward him was itself informative. Every person in that room, I observed, turned toward him with a speed that went beyond mere curiosity. "Inspector," he said, "before you proceed, I wonder if you would permit me 3 questions. Not of you, of the assembled company." Dimmock, conscious, perhaps that declining would create an awkward impression, agreed with reasonable grace. Holmes looked first at Edmund, made no attempt to leave the estate since Sir Reginald's death, despite having, as the inspector has established, both motive and proximity. Why? Edmund met his gaze directly. Because I did not do what is being suggested, and I saw no reason to behave as though I had. Holmes inclined his head and turned to Fane. The documents recovered from the study fireplace, which the inspector characterises as forged inheritance amendments. Were they in Sir Reginald's hand? The question landed differently from the others. Fane's expression did not change, but something behind it did, and I watched the effort he expended in ensuring that it did not reach his face. "I have not examined them personally," he said. "No," Holmes agreed pleasantly. "You have not, because if you had examined them, you would have been able to tell the inspector immediately that they are not amendments to inheritance at all. They are something rather different." He paused, but did not continue on this point. "My 3rd question is for Mrs. Clara Bellamy." Ford. Clara looked at him with an expression from which all social performance had temporarily departed, leaving something more honest and considerably more apprehensive. "When the inspector announced Edmund's arrest just now," Holmes said, "your response was not relief, or satisfaction, or even the ordinary release of tension that follows the apparent resolution of a crisis. Terror. I should like to understand why." Clara said nothing, but her hands, which had been folded quietly in her lap throughout Dimmock's presentation, pressed together with a pressure that whitened her knuckles, did not press her. He turned back to Dimmock and thanked him with every mark of sincerity. Dimmock followed this exchange with the expression of a man who suspects he is being managed, but cannot identify the mechanism. Proceeded with the arrest. As Edmund was escorted from the room with a composure that I found, in the circumstances, remarkable, the remaining members of the household dispersed with the subdued alacrity of people, grateful to no longer be required to occupy the same space. Fane left without speaking to anyone. Lionel went directly outside. Lady Honoria guided Clara away with the quiet authority of a woman who has, on previous occasions, performed this particular function. Holmes and I were left in the empty dining room with the constable's leather case, and the morning light coming cold through the long windows. "He is innocent," I said, not as a challenge, but as the conclusion I had reached watching Holmes's 3 questions and the responses they produced. "Entirely," Holmes said. He moved to the window and stood looking out at the grounds. "The forged documents would, as I told Fane, not benefit Edmund. They concern a different matter altogether, and their destruction was intended to prevent a revelation that has nothing to do with debt or succession." He turned. "Furthermore, The means by which the registry chamber was locked from within has been apparent to me since yesterday morning, and Edmund's involvement in it is precisely nil. I asked him about the locked room. In due course, he said, with the equanimity of a man who has not yet finished assembling what he needs. There are two things I require before I am prepared to proceed. First is an examination of Fane's professional correspondence, for which I shall need Lady Honoria's authority and Fane's absence, both of which I intend to arrange this afternoon. He picked up his hat from the sideboard. The second is a conversation with Lionel Bellamy. An honest one, which means I must first give him reason to believe that honesty is in his interest. And is it? I asked. Holmes considered this with what appeared to be genuine reflection. More than he knows, he said, considerably less than he deserves. He went out, and I stood for a moment longer in the quiet dining room, thinking about a man escorted from it in the custody of a Surrey constable. For a crime I was now satisfied he had not committed, while the persons who might have spoken chose, for reasons of their own, to hold their silence. The newspapers, as Holmes had predicted, already gathering. The story they had in hand was convenient, coherent, and entirely wrong. It is, I have found, the most dangerous kind. Chapter 8. The Contradiction of Character. Lady Honoria provided her authority without requiring explanation, which told me something about the degree to which she had arrived at her own conclusions about Julian Fane. Holmes presented the request simply. Access to the professional correspondence Fane maintained at the court in connection with Bellamy family affairs, and she signed the necessary authorization with the decisive pen of a woman who has been waiting to be asked. Fane's absence was arranged by Holmes with rather more ingenuity. He sent word to the solicitor that Inspector Dimmock wished to review certain financial documents relating to Edmund's loan applications at the village inn, where the inspector had established his temporary office, and that Fane's professional expertise would be of material assistance. This was entirely true, and Holmes had communicated as much to Dimmock, ensuring the summons was genuine. He had simply neglected to mention that Dimmock's interest in the financial documents would occupy Fane for considerably less time than the business Holmes intended to transact in his absence. The professional correspondence was kept in a leather trunk in the room Fane used as a study during his visits to Blackthorn Court, a small chamber off the east corridor that smelled of paper and cold hearth. Holmes worked through it with the systematic efficiency of a man who knows precisely what category of document he is searching for, and is therefore not distracted by what he is not. I assisted by reading and summarizing where he directed, working from the older files, while Holmes took the more recent ones. For some time, the material was straightforwardly dull. The ordinary apparatus, estate management, correspondence with banks and tenants and neighbouring solicitors, the accumulated paperwork of a practice that had served the Bellamy family for the better part of 3 decades. Then Holmes said, without particular emphasis, "Here." He held toward me a bundle of letters, secured with a faded ribbon that had been placed at the bottom of the trunk, beneath a layer of innocuous correspondence. Correspondence with the deliberateness of something hidden, rather than merely filed. The letters were 28 in number. The earliest was dated 32 years ago. The most recent was dated 14 months before our arrival at Blackthorn Court. They were written in a hand I did not recognise, addressed to Fane personally rather than professionally, and their content, as I read through them, within the increasing attention they demanded, constituted the clearest account of the matter we had yet encountered. Holmes read at my shoulder, in silence. The writer was a woman. She did not give her full name in any of the letters, signing only with an initial, I, and employing throughout a discretion of reference that suggested she was accustomed to correspondence that must not be readily interpretable by any eyes other than those it was intended for. Relationship to Fane was not stated, but the tone, the earliest letters, was one of trust placed in a professional advisor, and as the years advanced, the trust became something more complex. A dependency, then an anxiety, then in the final letters, a resignation of the specific quality produced by a long and unsuccessful effort to alter an inalienable fact. She had been, concluded before Holmes confirmed it, Isabel Farrant, or the woman who had been entered in the registry under that name. What the letters made plain, assembled in sequence, was this: the marriage between Arthur Graydon Bellamy and the woman who became Isabel Farrant in the registry had been genuine in all emotional respects and deficient in one legal one. Arthur had married her in a civil ceremony that Fane, at the time a young solicitor newly engaged by Sir Reginald, had assisted in registering the woman's true origin. The detail that Sir Reginald would subsequently find unacceptable, and that Fane had been employed to manage, was that she contracted a previous marriage abroad, in circumstances that she had believed dissolved, but which English law did not recognise as such. She was, in the strict legal meaning, a bigamist, though an unwitting one, and Lionel's birth, following from a marriage that was therefore void, rendered him illegitimate. Fane had known this within a year of the wedding. The letters confirmed it. He had not disclosed it to Sir Reginald, but had instead entered into a private arrangement with the woman. She would disappear from the Bellamy record, voluntarily, establishing no further claims upon the family, and he would ensure that Lionel's existence in the registry was maintained without reference to her, allowing the child to grow up within the Bellamy household under a fiction of legitimacy that depend entirely upon Fane's continued silence and continued management of the records. The arrangement had held for 30 years. It held because Fane's professional position depended upon it holding. Held because the woman, wherever she had gone, appeared to have made her peace with the terms. It held, most crucially, because Sir Reginald had not until recently possessed the particular combination of suspicion and investigative tenacity required to trace the original flaw in the record. When he had found it, he had gone to Fane. Holmes set the letters down and stood for a moment in the small cold study, the expression of a man completing a calculation whose result he had already known, but which he had needed to verify precisely. The confrontation in the library, I said, thinking of what the maid Perkins had overheard. The family name must survive. That was Fane. Almost, certainly, Holmes said. Sir Reginald had presented him with the discovery and demanded a full account. Fane's response was to argue for continued concealment on the grounds of the family's reputation. The same argument he had used 30 years before, when the original decision was made. Holmes moved to the window, where the east garden lay quiet in the afternoon pallor. Sir Reginald refused. He intended to correct the registry. Holmes confirmed, which is why he altered the household timetable 3 nights before his collapse. He needed privacy in the west corridor, not to hide what he was doing, but because he had summoned specific persons to the registry chamber separately, in sequence, to inform them of his intentions before he acted on them. He would have seen it as the correct procedure, notification before publication, in the manner of a man who respects process even when the process will cause pain. I absorbed this. And Clara? Clara was one of those he summoned. She had been told enough at some point to understand the nature of the secret. Perhaps by Fane. Perhaps she had reached her own conclusions. She would have known that exposure would not merely unsettle Lionel. It would destroy every relationship, every social connection, every unspoken accommodation that the Bellamy name made possible, including her own position. He paused. Terror at Edmund's arrest was not guilt, Watson. It was the terror of a person who knows that the wrong explanation has been accepted, and that the correct one, when it emerges, will be far worse for everyone she is trying to protect. I thought of Clara's pressed hands, whitened knuckles, the effort she had made to remain still in her chair, while Dimmock assembled his confident and mistaken case. Then we are not dealing with premeditated murder, I said. We are not, Holmes said. What occurred in the registry chamber was a confrontation that went wrong. Sir Reginald had arranged to meet at least one person there, in the night, alone. The evidence of what followed is not the evidence of a planned killing. It is the evidence of a struggle between people in extremity, and an accident within that struggle. He turned from the window. I know who was in that room, Watson. I know how the door came to be locked from within, and I know the precise mechanics of what produced Sir Reginald's fatal injury. What I am now arranging in my mind is how to present this in a manner that serves justice rather than merely satisfying procedure. This was, I recognised, a distinction that Holmes took seriously, and one that the law did not always observe. And Edmund? I said. Edmund will be released by morning, Holmes said, with a certainty that required no supporting argument. I shall speak to Dimmock this evening. The evidence against him will not survive the questions I intend to put to it. He collected his hat and coat from the chair by the door, and we went out into the corridor, closing the study behind us. Somewhere in the upper reaches of the house a clock struck 4, tone absorbed by the old stone, and returned diminished, as though even time operated at Blackthorn Court under the condition of being only partially acknowledged. "The Great Hall," Holmes said as we reached the main staircase. "Tomorrow afternoon, I think. 'Tis time this house reckoned with what it contains." Chapter 9. The Secret Within the Column. Edmund Bellamy returned to Blackthorn Court at noon the following day, having been released from the village constabulary, at Holmes's firm insistence, Dimmock's reluctant concession. He arrived in a hired trap, descended without assistance, and walked into the house with the careful, slightly altered bearing of a man who has spent a night in an unfamiliar room, thinking about things he would prefer not to have thought about. He did not speak to anyone in the entrance hall. He went upstairs and did not come down until Holmes sent word, at 2 o'clock, that he was requested in the great hall with the rest of the household. Holmes had spent the morning in a series of private conversations that he conducted with systematic purpose, and did not describe to me in detail. I knew he had spoken again with Lady Honoria, and I was reasonably certain he had spent some time with Lionel, because when Lionel appeared in the great hall that afternoon, he had about him a quality of resolved stillness that was entirely unlike his previous manner. The restless, glancing energy of their earlier encounters replaced by something quieter, and, I thought, rather more dignified. The great hall at Blackthorn Court was a room that had been designed in some earlier century to impress. It achieved this through proportion rather than ornament. High ceiling, flagged floor, fireplace of substantial dimensions. At the far end, in which a fire had been lit against the October chill, the household assembled in the particular configuration that such gatherings always produce, those with the most to fear positioned nearest the exits and furthest from one another, with less to conceal, taking whatever chairs were nearest to hand. Fane stood rather than sat, positioning himself beside the mantelpiece, with the studied composure of a man who has decided that the appearance of ease is his most valuable remaining asset. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes directed at a point on the floor between herself and Holmes. Lady Honoria occupied a chair to one side with the upright, watchful stillness of someone who has spent decades in proximity to difficult truths and has learned that the approach of one is best met without flinching. Dimmock was present because Holmes had invited him, the careful courtesy of a man who understands that professional dignity, properly managed, is a more reliable instrument than confrontation. The inspector stood near the door with his constable, and the expression of a man who has not yet decided whether this gathering represents an asset, threat to his investigation. Holmes stood before the fireplace. He did not pace or perform or engage in any of the theatrical preliminaries that popular accounts of such scenes sometimes attribute to him. He simply spoke in the measured, hurried tone of a man presenting an account he has verified to his own satisfaction. 31 years ago, he began, member of this family contracted a marriage that was invalid in English law. The woman he married had, in good faith, and in ignorance of the relevant legal impediment, been previously married abroad. That marriage had not been dissolved by any instrument that English courts would recognise. Julian Fane, that time newly engaged as the family solicitor, discovered this within the year. He paused. Fane said nothing. The quality of his silence had changed. Fane did not inform Sir Reginald, Holmes continued. He made an arrangement instead, with the woman, with the record, and with himself. The woman withdrew from Bellamy life entirely, leaving behind a registry entry that was technically present and materially meaningless. The child born of that marriage was registered under the Bellamy name. Fane maintained the administration of the family's affairs, year after year, decade after decade, in the knowledge that the foundation upon which those affairs rested contained a flaw that his continued professional attention required to conceal. His authority in this household depended not upon integrity, but upon a secret of sufficient size that its disclosure would destroy him along with those it more directly concerned. He turned his gaze briefly toward Lionel, who met it without expression. Captain Lionel Bellamy is, in strict legal terms, without legitimate claim to the Bellamy name. He knows this, or has suspected it with the particular conviction of a man who has lived beside a truth for long enough to feel its shape, without ever being shown its face. His bitterness has not been the bitterness of exclusion from inheritance. It has been the bitterness of a man who understands, in some fundamental part of himself, that the ground beneath him has never been entirely solid. Lionel looked at the floor. He did not speak. Sir Reginald, Holmes said, spent several years working backward through the registry with the systematic patience of man who has found an error and is determined to trace it to its origin. He found what he was looking for. He confronted Fane in the library, some nights before his death. Fane argued for continued concealment. Sir Reginald refused. He intended to correct the registry, to establish the record accurately, whatever the consequences for family reputation or social standing. In the days that followed, Sir Reginald summoned members of the household separately to inform them of his intentions. He altered the household timetable to secure the necessary privacy. He was not hiding what he proposed to do. He was giving those affected the prior notification that he considered their due. Holmes moved from the fireplace to the registry column, which stood at the far end of the hall. It had been brought from the chamber on Holmes's quiet instruction that morning, presence among the living rather than the dead stone of its usual room, gave it an oddly exposed quality, as though something that had been comfortable in shadow now stood unwillingly in the light. On the night of his collapse, Sir Reginald entered the registry chamber to begin the process of correction. He had with him the vellum document stored in the column's hidden compartment. The authentic record, kept separately from the falsified entries in the cabinets, which he had preserved as the instrument of eventual rectification. Holmes rested one hand briefly on the column's carved surface. He was not alone for long. He turned to Clara Bellamy. She had not moved since Holmes began to speak. She was looking at him now with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific word in long sentence and has at last heard it. Clara came to the chamber, Holmes said. Psst. Not to prevent Sir Reginald by violence. I want that understood clearly and without qualification. Psst. She came because she believed she could change his mind by the only argument she had not yet made, direct appeal to his feeling. For the family he had spent his life constructing. She had removed the vellum document from the column compartment some days earlier. She had, I should explain, obtained access to a duplicate key, through means I shall address presently, and had concealed it elsewhere, believing that without the original document, Sir Reginald's evidence was insufficient for any formal action. Sir Reginald had discovered the document was missing before she arrived. Their exchange became a struggle, not of violence in any premeditated sense, but of two people, in a confined stone room, in the extremity of an irresolvable conflict, each attempting to prevent what the other was determined to accomplish. In the course of that struggle, Sir Reginald fell. The edge of the column's stone plinth is sharp, and sits at precisely the height that would produce the injury the doctor recorded. Clara's hands had pressed together in her lap again with the same whitened intensity I had observed in the dining room the previous day. She said nothing. The locked door, I said, because I had been waiting since chapter 3 to understand it, because the question was now hanging openly in the room. Clara locked the chamber from within after Sir Reginald fell, Holmes said. She used the key she had obtained, a duplicate made from an impression she had taken of Sir Reginald's key some weeks earlier, when she had first understood how seriously he intended to proceed. She locked the door, extinguished her own lamp, and left through the window, which she relatched from outside by means of a hooked wire passed through the gap at the sash edge, a method that requires patience and a steady hand, both of which Mrs. Clara Bellamy possesses in considerable quantity. She then removed all trace of her wire, disposed of it, returned to her room by the exterior route before the household was raised. Outside, the Surrey afternoon continued its indifferent business. The concealment that followed, Holmes said, addressing the room as a whole, not the work of one person. The missing ledger, the altered schedules presented to Dimmock as misdirection, burned documents in the study. These were collective efforts, some undertaken separately, some in tacit coordination, all directed at the same end: the preservation of a name that several of those present valued above the truth of what had occurred. He looked from face to face without accusation. None of you acted from greed. I established that to my own satisfaction some days ago. You acted from fear of what exposure would take from you and from one another. Dimmock had, throughout this account, been making notes with the concentrated application of a man managing a more complex reality than he had prepared for. He looked up now. Question of charges. Is a question, Holmes said, for which I have certain observations that I would suggest you hear before reaching a conclusion. He had more to say. But the room, I felt, needed a moment in which to hold what had already been placed within it. The shape of 30 years of managed silence, and the point at which that silence had broken, and the accident that had occurred in that breaking. Outside, Rook called once from the elms along the drive, and was still. Chapter 10. The Rewritten Lineage. There is a particular quality of silence that follows the conclusion of a long-held secret's exposure. Not the silence of emptiness, but of a room in which the air itself has changed composition. As though something that had been suspended in it for years has finally settled. Great Hall at Blackthorn Court held that silence for a considerable interval after Holmes had finished speaking. And I observed, in the faces around me, the several varieties of aftermath that such a moment produces. Relief in some, grief in others, and in at least one case the particular blankness of a person who is deciding, in real time, what they are now permitted to feel. Dimmock, who recovered first, which was perhaps inevitable. His professional reflex being the most reliable instrument available to him in circumstances that had moved well beyond his original theory. He cleared his throat, consulted his notes, and addressed Holmes with the careful formality of a man who is adjusting his position without wishing to appear to do so. The death itself, he said. You characterize it as accidental. I characterize it as the consequence of a struggle between two people neither of whom intended the outcome that resulted, Holmes said. The fatal injury was produced by a fall against a fixed object in a confined space. There was no weapon. There was no plan. There was a confrontation that escalated beyond the capacity of either party to manage it, and a man died of it. He paused. Whether that satisfies the legal definition of culpable homicide is a question for a court, Inspector. What I can tell you with certainty is that it does not satisfy the definition of murder. Dimmock looked at Clara Bellamy. She had not moved from her chair, and she met his gaze with the composure of a woman who has, in the course of the last several minutes, passed through the worst of what she feared and discovered that she is still present on the other side of it. There is also the matter of Edmund Bellamy, Holmes said. Before Dimmock could speak again, he was arrested on evidence that will not sustain scrutiny. I trust that situation will be corrected with the same vigour with which it was initiated. It has already been corrected, Dimmock said, with the slight stiffness of a man conceding a point he has not fully digested. He turned again to Clara, then to Holmes, and then appeared to reach, with visible effort, the conclusion that the next several hours would require more careful management than he had come to Blackthorn Court prepared to provide. He withdrew with his constable to the corridor, having communicated to Holmes, with a look rather than words, that he would require a private conversations before the afternoon was out. The room, thus reduced, held its remaining occupants in the particular configuration of people who must now speak to one another, without the structure that a formal proceeding provides. It was Lady Honoria who moved first. She rose from her chair and crossed to where Clara sat, stood before her for a moment in silence. Then she said, quietly enough that I was not entirely certain I was intended to hear it, He would not have been persuaded. You know that. Clara looked up at her. I know it now, she said. I think I knew it then. Psst. Holmes had moved to the window while this exchange occurred, directing his attention to the grounds outside with the consideration of a man who understands that some conversations require the temporary absence of a witness. I followed his example, finding a considerable interest in the far end of the hall. Lionel departed the great hall without speaking to anyone, which I had not expected, and which Holmes, when I mentioned it, found entirely consistent. He has had the longest to prepare for this moment, he said, and has spent that preparation learning how to receive it alone. The company of others will not help him today, gone from the estate. By the following morning, I later learned, not in flight, but with the deliberateness of a man who has decided that the place where he received news of a certain quality is not the place in which he wishes to consider its implications. He left a note for Lady Honoria that none of them showed me, though she mentioned existence. Its existence with an expression that suggested it had contained more honesty than she had expected of him. The day that followed Holmes's revelation in the great hall was, in its outward character, quieter than any we had spent at Blackthorn Court, the business of resolution, I have observed over many years in Holmes's company, rarely resembles its dramatic anticipation. It is accomplished in corridors and private rooms, and modest offices, in conversations that lack the formal architecture of confrontation, and it produces not catharsis but adjustment. The slow recalibration of circumstances to accommodate a new and often unwelcome set of facts. Holmes spent the afternoon with Dimmock, and whatever passed between them was sufficient to redirect the inspector's investigation away from Clara toward the question of Fane. The solicitor, whose 30 years of maintained deception had, Holmes argued, constituted the originating condition, from which every subsequent consequence had followed, the appropriate object of whatever formal proceedings the evidence could sustain. The argument was not without its difficulties, Holmes acknowledged to me later. But Dimmock was a man of more conscience than method, and when presented with a clear account of Fane's professional conduct over 3 decades, he found his inclinations and his duty in sufficient alignment to proceed. Fane himself, when the nature of the case against him became apparent, elected retirement, with a dispatch that suggested he had been prepared for the possibility. No. Public accusation was made. His practice dissolved quietly in the weeks that followed, and his name, like her Isabel Farrant's, retreated from the record without formal ceremony. Holmes remarked, without apparent satisfaction, that this was perhaps the most fitting conclusion available, that the man who had built his authority upon a secret should end his career in the same condition of careful invisibility he had imposed upon others. Edmund Bellamy left England within the fortnight. His departure was not the flight of the accused, but the considered decision of a man who has discovered that the inheritance he had staked his credit upon will not materialize in the form he anticipated, and who has sense enough to begin again in a context where his debts are not yet widely known. He called upon Holmes before he left, which surprised me, and thanked him with a directness I found rather admirable under the circumstances. Holmes wished him well, with what appeared to be genuine feeling. Lady Honoria ordered the registry chamber permanently sealed on the 3rd day after the great hall assembly, and instructed Cranfield to arrange for the chamber's contents to be transferred to the care of a London archive, whose discretion she had reason to trust. The registry column remained in the great hall for some days before being returned to the chamber and sealed within it. I passed through the hall on our final evening at Blackthorn Court and paused before it, for a moment looking at the carved panel, whose seam was now invisible to me again, though I knew precisely where it lay. It seemed to me, in the lamplight, less a monument than a lesson, the kind that takes the form of an object and persists after the occasion that produced it has been resolved and tidied and assigned to the past. Holmes and I departed Blackthorn Court on the morning of the 4th day after the gathering, trap, following the same elms-lined approach road by which we had arrived. The Surrey countryside around us, in the full authority of late October, the colour gone from the leaves, and the fields retreating toward the particular spare beauty that precedes winter. We were nearly at Fenwick Cross before I asked the question that had been forming, in various configurations, since Holmes had concluded his account in the great hall. "Has justice been served?" I said. On the whole, Holmes was quiet for a moment, profile angled toward the passing hedgerows in the attitude I recognised from our outward journey. That quality of attention that is not quite seeing and not quite thinking, but something combining the two. "In matters of family," he said at last, "society often punishes exposure more severely than deception. One may preserve a name for generations, and lose every honourable quality in the process." He was silent again for a moment. Sir Reginald understood that in the end. It is why he refused to maintain the silence any longer, even at the cost he could not entirely have anticipated. He turned from the hedgerows and looked at me directly, which he did not always do when he was being serious. Whether a man who dies insisting upon the truth has been served by justice is a question that depends rather heavily upon what one believes justice is for. I considered this for the remainder of the journey, and found, I often do, when Holmes has genuinely engaged with a question, rather than merely answered it, that I was not entirely certain of my own position. Train back to London was warm and largely empty, and Holmes read a monograph on the preservation of paper documents in humid conditions, which he had obtained from somewhere within the house, and which he finished before we reached Waterloo. I watched the Surrey fields give way to the outskirts of the city, and thought about a hollow column standing sealed in a stone room, and an old man who had spent years looking for a truth he would not live to correct, and a name written in fresh ink over an older one, and the question of what it costs to insist upon accuracy when the world has arranged itself, with considerable effort, around a comfortable error. It is a question, I have found, that does not resolve itself simply by being asked.